I want to talk about race. So the battle over critical race theory in the schools, Christopher Rufo, one of our guys. The larger battle about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Heather McDonald just had a piece on medical education that I read with great interest in your magazine, our magazine, City Journal, one of our gals. You're in New York City, tinderbox and all of that. There's a lot of structural tensions going on the racial front. How do you see positioning the Institute in this big culture, political arena of conflict around racial justice in the post-George Floyd era?
This is a very big, profound set of questions. We have people at the Institute who have somewhat different approaches to it, how to think about it. I will say, for my purposes, I really believe that there are a lot of shibboleths about race and identity that we're seeing come undone right before our eyes. The whole construct of people of color, the idea of flattening the experiences and sensibilities of these kind of census-created categories, I think that stuff is just blowing up right now. So I think that it's a very important moment because of that for fresh thinking. I think that in a way, having identities that feel more bottom up and that are kind of driven by mutual aid and by, driven by shared history and a belief in shared history, I think that that's important and dignity bearing. And I think that identities that are imposed from above, I think they're problematic, man. I mean, I think that there's a way in which, and there can be a place for them. And there's oftentimes a good reason why we're like, hey, there are communities that are historically disadvantaged and stigmatized. And, for the purposes of understanding, we want to kind of highlight them and understand them. I get that. But I also worry about reifying and actually I create my group boundaries because they serve my purposes. I'm elite University X, and defining group boundaries in this way and then saying that an authentic representative of the group thinks these things, that serves my purposes. But I don't know about what serves my purposes as actually a member of a living, breathing community. You know what I mean? And there might be a tension between those two things. And particularly when you're talking about communities that are historically disadvantaged, where you haven't necessarily had the same kind of wealth creation and institution building, that means that, hey, I'm going to start pushing you around. If you are someone who denies the Armenian genocide, then I'm going to have a problem with it. And by the way, I've got a lot of other people of Armenian descent here, and they're going to make a stink about it too. And you're going to have to answer to us. Like, in some ways, the new discourse we have about race and ethnicity, part of it, I think, is a healthy reflection of the fact that different people are rich now. Different people are famous now. Different people have power now. And they're going to exert that power. And that might be uncomfortable. They're going to exert that power politically, economically, and otherwise. I think that that is something that is a good, healthy, natural thing. But to what extent is it not that kind of exercise of power, that kind of democratic contestation, that kind of economic contestation? To what extent is it, and again, I'm going to sound silly and crude, but to what extent is it something that is driven by institutions that are not kind of organic in that kind of way, that are not actually reflecting that kind of interplay of mutual aid, self-help, communal power? So that's one reason why I'm so obsessed with you, Glenn, because I got to think that when you talk about Black self-making, when you wrote about the development narrative, to me, that was my lodestar. That is this idea that, and again, like when you talk about the bias narrative and the development narrative, you're not saying that the bias narrative is wrong and the development narrative is right. It's more complicated than that. It's just, which do you emphasize when? What is going to be our framework for understanding our challenges, our condition? Even it could be that bias is pervasive. Well, then what do you do about that? Kind of fixating on the bias narrative. It's not obvious that you continue to kind of fixate on it. So the development narrative idea to me is so interesting. And I think that it's an idea that is almost this folk idea that makes so much sense to so many people, but there aren't that many articulate scholarly champions of that idea, partly because it's a textured idea. It's an idea that requires a sensitivity and narrative understanding. It's not something that is easily quantifiable. You know what I'm talking about? I don't know. So I just think that to me is very important. And that is a big part of how I think about progress and group membership and group identity, and the things that I think are we overweight and the things we underweight.
I confess to being of two minds about this bottom-up idea about racial identity and about where the boundaries get drawn and how we identify. On the one hand, I want to say, in the spirit of a kind of liberal or even a libertarian kind of, let's look at individuals and let's not put people in these boxes. People are Black or they're Latino or they're Asian, quote unquote. We have these horrible things, they're BIPOCs, they're people of color, these aggregations that are politically instrumental, but that I think are false to reality. And I want to, tell young people of color, the world is your oyster and you can be anything and you can do anything and don't limit yourself. I want to tell my college students, read broadly, think broadly, learn languages, expose yourself to things. Don't come in here like that. On the other hand, I want to exhort, quote unquote, my people to act. I want agency. I want collective action. I want people to be motivated by a sense of duty to their future generations, to a sense of obligation because of the sacrifices of past generations. I want to embrace a narrative that's thick with racial content as an African American, even though I also in the 21st century, with the world getting very small, want people to open up and embrace and be free. So I got into this discussion with Camille Foster, whom you will know, who is a race abolitionist, if I understand him correctly. He's Black in appearance, but he says, don't call me Black. I'm not Black. I mean, don't put me in that box. I'm a man. I'm a human being. I'm an American. I'm a father. I'm an intellectual, like that. And I was saying, yeah, I agree. But if we think the Black family is part of the developmental problem, that kids are not getting the kind of support that they need and the kind of nurturance that they need, in part because of the way that men and women are relating to each other, marrying, forming family, and so forth, how do we even begin to talk in a effective way about mobilizing our cultural resources on behalf of the project of raising our kids if we don't have this framework and this interpretation of our history, quote unquote, to draw on? So I'm of two minds about it.
One thing that is very kind of confusing, fraught, and contested, and I'm curious to see how it unfolds, is the fact that because of the rise of the first and second generation Black population, and because of the rise of these complex dynamics of colorism happening against the backdrop of the emergence of a mixed race Black population that, is perhaps overrepresented among people who are educated and affluent and are in positions of influence. I'm curious about how that affects these dynamics, not just of Black political unity, but of what it actually means. You have these interesting internet subcultures, that, for example, are skeptical towards conventional feminism. But then when you're looking at Black political power, it's not just Black Americans, but Black women who are this incredibly important bulwark of democratic political strength, not just when it comes to, the voting base, but when it comes to who are people who are increasingly important as policy thinkers, as intellectuals, who are people who have been kind of really generative, and who kind of embrace a kind of, call it intersectional feminism, as applied to policy. These are really interesting dynamics where I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that there's some reaction that does not necessarily translate into people voting for Republicans en masse, but in thinking that, hey, the talented 10th is not what it was in, the Du Bois era, kind of when you had these intensely segregated cities and you had this, professional class that earned its keep by kind of serving this segregated population. Now, you have a talented 10th, that, kind of basically swims in the sea of kind of selective higher education and the universe that it creates. People sometimes will say that, selective higher education is marginal. People like you fixate on that too much. But, in a way, it's like the moral imagination of so much of the upper middle class, Black or non-Black, is to some degree formed by admissions offices. Because the admissions office says, we want well-rounded kids, or we want well-lopsided kids. There's a kind of wonderful new book about this called Little Platoons. But it's sort of like, like in saying that you establish what parents want to do, whether they know it or not. You know what I mean? Like every single school is going to kind of move in that direction. So when you have that cleavage among Black Americans, I think that it introduces the possibility of a dissenting faction within the talented 10th, call it that. You kind of have room for these different voices, which again, you can kind of marginalize and kind of say, these are people who are irrelevant, kind of this doesn't matter. They don't speak for anyone. You could say that for a while, but then when you have these political earthquakes, intra-democratic political earthquakes, by the way, when you kind of see these different people emerge, I think that's really interesting. And then, I don't know, like, do you see some counter-elite emerge? That might be a bridge too far, but